Well, hello everyone. Very warm welcome to you all. This is Martin Lush here, Senior Vice President, almost promoted myself then, VP for Health Sciences, largely responsible for pharmaceuticals and medical devices across the world. So it's a great pleasure to connect with you on this webinar. It's interesting to start off with. Liz has dropped me a note saying, Martin, not sure if this is the right webinar. I subscribe to one called Disruptive Thinking. Well, as I said, I've changed the title slightly because in this world that is incredibly disruptive, we need to change the way that we think. And instead of just talking about critical thinking or disruptive thinking, I try to narrow it down even more to say, look, let's just get really good at answering really interesting and intelligent questions. So answers to your big questions, industry's big questions if you like, and the vital importance of becoming a questionologist, a new word that I've created that always comes up on spell checks. So very warm welcome to you all. This is the first in our program of free webinars for 2019. And we'll start with a question. Quick question for you. What would you do if you knew you could not fail? Just think about that question for a moment. Interestingly, I had a strategic planning session with my management and leadership team some months ago. And normally in a strategic planning session, they always tend to follow the same sort of process around, what does the environment look like? What is it we need to do in the future to prepare for that environment? But instead, I actually started off with a question. How do we become the business that would put us out of business in 5 years? Now, that was met with some strange quizzical faces, but it actually reshaped the entire conversation. Instead of just talking about what are the future trends, let's do a SWOT analysis, what skills and resources do we need, etc., etc., etc. By asking it a different question, it actually changed the perspective from which everybody viewed the challenge that we all face. So really, what I want to do in this session, ladies and gentlemen, is to take just time out of our busy schedules and think more about whether you call it disruptive thinking, critical thinking, asking good questions. They're all the same. Because the point I really want to get across is that in this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, we've got to make really, really good decisions. In reality, we've got to make far better decisions than we have made in the past. But the challenge is we're not wired to make good decisions. If you reflect on your own decisions or decisions that you observe being taken in your company, decisions are all affected by bias. We all have a tendency to play safe. We all have a desire, a comfort in staying with what we know, in other words, maintaining the status quo. And how many of us either do or observe people going by gut feel? They base their decision on assumptions and biases based upon past experience and knowledge, when in reality the world is moving so quickly that actually that past experience and knowledge in some cases is absolutely irrelevant. And there's a lot of data and science that says don't go by your gut feel. Gut feel not 9 times out of 10, but most of the time has proven to be wrong. So really what I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to talk about how do we ask better questions that actually take our businesses, our departments, our labs, our units into different directions, purely by asking a different question that actually challenges people to think about the situation from a different angle. Because the reality for most, and this is not a criticism, it's just a habit that most people have, is we apply the same old thinking to get the same old results in a world that is now completely different. Because there are two simple facts, indisputable facts, that things are now different in whether it be globally, economically, politically, industrially, whether you're in pharmaceuticals or medical devices or in healthcare generally. Healthcare that we all represent in some small part is at a tipping point, with digital medicine, with economies that can't afford healthcare for its aging population. The world has changed and the dynamics of our industry have changed and the problems that we're facing have changed, which means that gut feel and that bias that protected our ancestors from extinction actually is now outdated in what is a very, very different world. So two simple things are true. One is now things are very different, and also the realization that what got us here is not going to get us to where we need to be necessarily. So one of the challenges we have is how do we override, how do we manage, how do we control the decision-making processes that evolution have given us, that desire to, as we said earlier, to be safe, to maintain the status quo, to be influenced by bias. In order to overcome those, that's a real challenge. And really, the objective of this session is to really challenge you not to think about making a decision, but to actually think more about asking really big questions. Now, those big questions, by their very nature, are encouraging us, driving us to be critical thinkers. They're forcing us to be disruptive thinkers. Because becoming a questionologist, in other words, to really think and refine our questioning skills and abilities, well, what does it do? Well, it stimulates discussion. It provokes different ways of thinking. It encourages, it invites people to think differently rather than to assume or to be influenced by groupthink or to naturally go for the comfort of maintaining the status quo or to play safe. And in some cases, to avoid the reality of what is happening in the outside world. And importantly, the ability to ask really disruptive questions, to think disruptively by doing so, encourages people to disagree thoughtfully rather than to enter into arguments or conflict. So often when you're in meetings or having sessions to decide on a course of action, what often happens, certainly in my experience, is that there's very little exploration of the subject. There's very little thought given to looking at different ways of solving the problem. More energy and more time tends to be consumed in arguing or debating or protecting your particular position. So the beauty of asking really big questions, refining your skills as a questionologist, if you like, is to become that disruptive thinker. Because the reality in the world that we are living in, will continue to live in, is that nothing is going to go according to plan, and that we're going to have to work around, under, over, barriers that we don't exist, and we can guarantee that something is going to fall out of the sky that we never anticipated, that completely changes the situation and the circumstances. So really what I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, when I sent out the invitation for this webinar, I actually posed a few questions, and these are questions that have not been made up. These are questions that have been posed to me by many clients over the last couple of years. And what I want to do is just to give you a sample of how thinking more about the question rather than the decision can actually lead disruptively to a completely different outcome. So here's an example. This was probably about 15 months ago, one of my colleagues, not in Europe or the US, but one of our clients out in Asia, actually phoned me up and said, Martin, we were actually going to run a training course there, and he said, Martin, unfortunately, it can't go ahead because budgets have been cut by 30% across the business. And I don't know what to do about it. We have compliance issues, we have challenges across the business. What do I do about it? What do I say to my QA team when I actually meet them in a couple of weeks' time? And I said, look, what you've got to do is to pose them a question and ask them this question. How can we, quality assurance, generate $30 million in real savings for the business? Now, he thought long and hard about that. He said, well, I would never have thought about asking that question. I would have gone into that meeting saying, who are we going to cut? What activities are we going to stop? So it would have been a discussion with a completely different outcome. I said, well, just ask this question. And I gave him some guidance as to the process that he could follow. But the long and short of it was that the areas that they then explored as a result of that disruptive thinking through a big question being asked was actually they thought about BMR simplification, and they initiated a hierarchy of review in their batch records where manufacturing review 80%, QA 15%, the QP 5%. They drove down accountability where it was needed. They designed simple checklists to ensure that all of the variables were checked. And they, through this BMR simplification process, and I've written about this extensively in the past, and if you need more references as to how to achieve simplification of your batch manufacturing record, just let me know, because I can send you those in due course. But the bottom line was at the end of this 6 to 8 week program of work, what results did they achieve? Well, they had better right first time. They had substantial savings in excess of $3.6 million over a six-month period. And what it allowed them to do was to go back to the business and say, look, we understand budgets have to be cut, and we have contributed to those savings without risk to our license, without risk to regulatory compliance. And guess what happened? They got more resource. They actually got more resource, not less. So as a result of looking at this problem from a different angle by asking a big question, that level of disruptive thinking actually changed the outcome considerably. One of the questions that was posed to me, because I did invite lots of questions to come in, unfortunately not many did, but I understand why. But one of the questions that was sent to me related to training. And it basically alluded to, Martin, we spend an awful lot of money on training. We don't seem to get much in return. And another one of you asked, well, what is the best method to assess training effectiveness? Really, really simple question and straightforward question. So the problem is we spend lots on training. We don't seem to get much back. What do we need to do about that? And often the result of that straightforward question is, well, we've got to measure the effectiveness. And what I said to this particular company is, look, you're asking the wrong question, therefore you're going to get the wrong answer. The question I asked is, well, what are you trying to measure and why? Are you trying to prove compliance? In other words, your method of assessment is driven by the desire to show the training has been done for the benefit of a regulator. Are you trying to measure short-term memory? Because let's face it, any assessment done immediately after a particular training session is only measuring short-term memory, as well as measuring probably the effectiveness of the trainer. And it's interesting, when I ask this question of various companies, some of them say, well, actually, yes, Martin, we are doing training just for a compliance tick box exercise, or yes, we are doing it to prove that they have knowledge in the short term. Now, for me, education, training is, we at NSF actually make a distinction between training and education. We say, you train your pets, you educate your children. Training is that, you give information so that others may follow. Education is when you affect the way people think so that they change their behaviours in the workplace. So I said to this particular company, I said, well, are you trying to measure the impact of that exercise, that training course, whatever format it takes, by what you see changing in the workplace? And they said, absolutely. I said, well, don't waste time doing an assessment at the end of the course, because that will not do anything other than challenge their short-term memory. Because what we do know, and this is a model that I've presented on and written about many times, you haven't heard about it before, and I will send you more information, but we know that behavior at any level is influenced by 4 components. Internal motivation, that's personal, intrinsic, what's in it for me. Ability refers to the knowledge that people have. Do they understand the why as well as the how, as well as the simplicity of the task that faces them. T stands for the trigger, because everybody needs to be reminded as to what they need to do. And then finally, you need to create the habit loop, the routine and the reward. So the bottom line is that if you're not getting the desired behavior in the workplace, it can be down to any one or all of these: lack of intrinsic motivation, inability through lack of underpinning knowledge, or over complexity, absence of a trigger event or cue, or failure to practice precisely so that behavior becomes habituated. So with this particular company, when they understood through that disruptive question, that critical thinking exercise, that actually the purpose of their education program was to actually improve workplace behaviors, they started to analyze different things when they were not seeing those desired behaviors in the workplace. They started to talk to people around, are you intrinsically motivated? Are you really engaged with this? Well, yes, we are. What's the, do you have the ability? Yeah, we have the knowledge, but you know what? The SOP is so complicated, or the process is so complex that we can't follow it. And by the way, it's so complex, there's no trigger, there's no reminder, and it's so complex that we have not had the time to habituate through practice the routine, therefore we get inconsistencies in practice. So, when you go back to the question, the original question was, how do we measure training effectiveness? The proper question is, well, what is it we're trying to measure and why? Well, the answer is workplace behaviors, and that drives a completely different course of action to ensure those behaviors are there. And if they're not, to properly analyze, is it lack of motivation? Is it lack of ability? Is it lack of a trigger event or failure to habituate? Or is it a combination of all of the above? This is an interesting one. This goes back probably 11 months ago. I've been working with one particular client for the best part of 2 to 3 years. And I think it's fair to say they've struggled with the regulatory agencies. And the bottom line is the regulators simply didn't trust them. Every inspection, and they had many, every inspection they had that feeling of we are guilty until proven innocent. And the question they posed to me is, Martin, we need your guidance on how do we prepare more thoroughly and properly for this inspection. And I thought, well, that's the wrong question. I said, well, why are you asking that question? Well, we feel we're on a back foot with the regulators. Why is that? Well, they clearly don't trust us. So the question I posed, this disruptive thought process, this critical thinking question was, well, what have you done to make them feel this way? And there was a kind of silence in the room. I said, well, you have done something. And then it led to a lot of very open discussion around, you know what, we put an awful lot of effort in over preparation and audit management. And maybe the auditor feels as if it's audit by numbers and they're being managed. We also know that, you know, people enter that audit incredibly tired and anxious. You know, we tell them what to say, we tell them what not to say. We know that there is miscommunication, that there is inconsistency that could have led to misinterpretation because of language difficulties. We know we have a hierarchy where managers want to answer first and subordinates don't get the opportunity. We know we've created panic by trying to defend the indefensible. So by actually asking a different question, it actually led to a completely different analysis of what got us there. So then I asked them this other question, well, why don't you tell them everything up front? This was rather interesting. There was an even longer silence at this point, and it was what I call one of these tumbleweed moments. It was almost as if everything kind of slowed down and went in slow motion, and this tumbleweed blew through the conference room until the CEO said, what did you just say? I said, well, tell them everything. Why would we want to do that? I said, well, why would you not? Because frankly, that secretive audit preparedness stroke manipulation has got you to where you are. So as Einstein famously said, insanity is defined as the same thing and expecting a different result. Why would you do the same thing? So to all credit of that leadership team, they said, you know what, it can't get any worse, can it, Martin? I said, no, it can't, because you're under an import alert ban. You've got to rebuild trust. That is a 2 to 3 year process, so set expectations accordingly. But that's what they did. They actually, in all honesty, said to the regulators, look, in preparation for the audit in 6 weeks' time, here's our dirty laundry. Here are all of the issues identified by our self-inspection program. Here's our deviation data, our customer complaint data. Here's our risk-based reasoning for why we've put these in high, medium, and low categories. Here are the options that we're considering. This is what we're tackling. This is what we've finished. This is what we're planning to do. Here's the budget. Here's the action plan and status. They turn to their entire workforce and say, you know what, that old rule of this just answer with a yes or no, you know, you all know your job, you're all experts, just impress the auditor one at a time with your knowledge, with your passion, and with your commitment. And also what this particular company did was they introduced patients into their workplace. They had patients sitting on their site leadership team meetings. They had patients sitting in on their quality review meetings because they wanted to ensure their patients trusted them as well. And, you know, many of you probably sat there thinking, heck, you know, that would never happen here. But, well, they did it. They had the courage to do it. And true to form, 18 months it took them before the regulator said, you know what, we're done here. This is a good operation. We'll see you in 3 years' time. Now, would they have achieved that if they had stuck with their own model? Well, we don't know. But the point I'm making is that by asking that disruptive question, by really forcing people to think not more of the same, not play safe, not run away from risk, but by asking a different question, you can invite that critical thinking. Another example, and I'm just throwing examples at you, ladies and gentlemen, just to give you a sense of the practicalities and the possibilities that this provides. One of our clients had a real challenge with repeat deviations, and the question they posed me is, Martin, you know, we've gone through root cause analysis, we've done all of that, hasn't had any effect, we're still fighting fires, we want your advice on how to reduce deviations. I said that's the wrong question. The question you want to ask everybody is, how do we get people to love deviations and want to raise even more? And there was a silence, and more tumbleweed blew through the room, followed by more. But eventually they said, well, what do you mean? And we discussed and we explored where we were coming from. And that exploration led into, well, what measures are we applying? What measures can we put in place to encourage people to raise deviations? How do we encourage black box thinking, where problems are seen as a catalyst for continuous improvement? How do we get people to think error chain, not root cause? Because there is no such thing as root cause. If we think error chain, we get into the roots of the problem, the contributing factors to do with culture and leadership, not just people. Let's embark on doing the Gemba in 10 minutes. So from the incident being raised to a team arriving to do the assessment and the risk ranking. So they introduced customized risk-based ranking processes, simple checklists that we help them design and deliver. And then finally they said, you know what, we're not going to call it the deviation and kappa system anymore. We're going to call it the deviation and PACA system. Because any good deviation system focuses on prevention, not correction. Now, I've really summarized what was the best part of 3 or 4 days intensive discussion very, very quickly. But the illustration is there to demonstrate that when you change the focal point with a different question, what you get is a completely different avenue, completely different set of results. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I actually believe, I don't listen to the radio and I try and not watch the news too much because it kind of has you running to the hills or the bar, you can choose which. I actually believe it's a fantastic time to be alive because the challenges that we face are not going to be met by the old style of thinking and the old style of decision making. It's a great time to be alive. It's a great time to exist in the healthcare and pharmaceutical and medical device industries, because only if you become, whether you call it a disruptive thinker, a critical thinker, or a great questionologist, it's probably the hardest out of all three to say, the future is incredibly bright and incredibly exciting. Now, during this session, ladies and gentlemen, I focused very much on one aspect, and that is the ability to ask what I call big questions. Big in the sense that they force people to view a particular situation or circumstance from a completely different angle. Now, please remember, when faced with a decision, when faced with a problem, there is a natural desire. We're wired to look for a very quick solution. We're wired to look for a very, very quick decision based on bias, based on gut feel, based on assumption. What I'm saying is, look, instead of being driven to the answer, the solution, focus on the big questions. Encourage what I call thoughtful disagreement. Now, I've talked a lot about my garrote method of decision making. In the past, I've talked a lot about six-hats thinking and force field analysis. If you want those references, please let me know. I will send them to you. The point I'm really emphasizing here is that there are processes, there are tools and techniques that are simple, but very effective in getting people to park their emotion, park their assumption, and thoughtfully disagree. And what I mean by thoughtfully disagree is that you don't criticize or take a particular position. You just build on solutions, build on different questions and different answers, so you get to one that is better than any other. So if you're not getting the desired results, change your questions. And please drop me a line if you have questions that you aren't getting the desired results or solution from. please drop me a line and I'll give you my kind of unedited, simple view on what questions you should be asking. So questions, guys, take these questions to share with your colleagues. You know, every company is challenged by winning the talent war. You don't win the talent war, your business won't be around for long. Don't think about recruitment. Don't think about leadership development. The question companies should be asking is, how do we introduce a mentorship program with our baby boomers? In other words, our most experienced people that are leaving the business, how do we encourage them to stay and guide others? Because I tell you what, in a lot of my friends and colleagues who are now retired, everyone I've spoken to about any remorses, any regrets, to a person, they have said to me, Martin, my biggest regret is I never had the opportunity of passing on my experience to others. Never given the opportunity. And you know what? If my company had said, would you do it for free, I probably would have done it for free. So instead of thinking about how do we recruit, how do we attract and retain, you change the focal point as to, well, actually, there's an easy way of doing this. First and foremost is, how do we introduce a mentorship scheme for our baby boomers? It's not about, doesn't answer directly the question around the talent war, but I tell you what, it's about talent retention, not getting new bodies in. Change management. The question you ask all of those that use the change management system, ask them this question: how do we ensure our system just approves the 20% of changes that add value and reject the rest? Because a good change management system does that. Now, that question drives a whole new approach to the problem of change management, which in most companies is a real challenge. Because when you and every change management system must discriminate between the good, the bad, and the indifferent. Most systems don't. If you want to know how to do this, drop me a line, because we've, again, got extensive references for you. Improving SOP compliance. I often get asked the question, how do you improve SOP compliance? I said, wrong question. The right question is, how do we move to YouTube-style instruction and forget paper? Because people don't follow instructions anymore. If you want to fix something, if you want to build something, what do? You YouTube it. So our brains are now wired and conditioned for video-style instruction, and yet what do? We write reams and reams of paper that people don't understand, and because they don't understand, they create the shortcuts. So again, a completely different question that drives a completely different avenue of investigation and discussion and ultimately decision making. So my challenge to you, ladies and gentlemen, is go away, create a culture of curiosity, because we're not, it's no longer one track going through, open countryside. We're going to be more on the left-hand side, where we don't really know when the next bend is coming. Now, creating an environment where you can have those open discussions, what I call thoughtful disagreements, that allow you to be more critical and more disruptive in your thinking, is another challenge, maybe a subject of another webinar. But nonetheless, it's going to be critical in a world full of disruption. But you know what? It's going to be a blast. I spent most of my time feeling like that guy on the right-hand side there. Because truly, I think the types of changes and the magnitude and volume and diversity of challenges and changes we're going to see in the next 5 years will exceed what I've seen in the last 40 years in my career. So this is not going to be dull. It's not going to be boring. It's going to be a real blast. Now, one of my commitments to you, everyone, is to provide ongoing support. And actually, my kind of stimulus for this webinar came out from a book that I read recently called The Book of Beautiful Questions by Warren Burger. So, there's a whole lot of very thought-provoking narrative in there that, if you're really interested in this, I sincerely hope you are, because your future actually depends on it. And I'm not on a commission, but it's a really good book that gives you insight into it. But please, if you've got any feedback, any further questions, please drop me a line on my email address. I'm more than happy to send you a recommended reading list additional white papers relating to behavioural change in the workplace or change management processes, so that you do just focus on the 20% that really do matter. NSF's got a library of YouTube videos that communicate essential messages as well. If you've got more questions that you would like answered in depth, please send them to me. The challenge to you all is simply this: just become a far better questionologist. Practice questionologist first. It takes time before it's fluent. But the point I'm making really is that in a world of disruption, we have to excel at disruptive thinking, brackets critical thinking, and one key vehicle for that is through being a great questioner. If you want a guidance source on how to create what I call an idea meritocracy, please let me know, because the truth is, and it's a very sad fact, that most companies only use 10% at most of their intellectual capability or capacity, because the rest of the workforce are totally disengaged, because they're not allowed to ask the questions that normally, get us to solutions that we would never normally get to. So please stay in touch. There's my contact details there. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I've written a lot of articles on things like black box thinking, so please take a look. Please download our app, which is full of incredibly useful information and resources, all free, all at the touch of a button. So one last question, finally. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? Go away and think about it. Thank you very much, everyone, and please stay in touch.